In 1399, a reigning English king was formally deposed by his cousin, and Parliament declared that he had forfeited the crown. The removal of Richard II did not occur through foreign conquest or natural succession, but through a calculated political intervention that redefined the relationship between monarchy and political community. For the first time since the Norman conquest, a king was displaced on grounds articulated as constitutional failure. The precedent would endure. Richard II, grandson of Edward III, had inherited the throne in 1377 at the age of 10. His minority government and later personal rule were marked by tensions with the higher nobility. Records of the merciless Parliament of 1388 indicate deep aristocratic opposition to royal favorites, culminating in executions and political humiliation. Although Richard regained authority in the 1390s, chroniclers such as the Westminster Chronicle describe an increasingly autocratic style of governance. The king's decision in 1397 to arrest and later execute Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, signaled his determination to suppress opposition. The immediate crisis emerged from Richard's conflict with Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. In 1398, Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, accused one another of treason. Richard resolved the dispute by exiling both men. When John of Gaunt died in February 1399, Richard confiscated the Lancastrian estates rather than allowing Bolingbroke to inherit them. This action, recorded in royal administrative rolls, expanded the dispute from personal grievance to dynastic violation. By denying hereditary succession within the nobility, Richard alienated a powerful political network. Bolingbroke returned to England in July 1399 while Richard was campaigning in Ireland. Initially, he claimed only the restoration of his inheritance. However, support from key magnates, including the Percy family of Northumberland, shifted the balance of power. Contemporary sources, such as the Chronicle of Adam of Usk, describe the rapid collapse of royal resistance. Richard was captured in August and transported to the Tower of London. In September, Parliament convened to consider his fate. The parliamentary record of September 30, 1399 outlines 33 articles accusing Richard of tyranny, misgovernment, and violation of coronation oaths. These charges framed deposition not as rebellion but as lawful correction. Richard formally abdicated, though the circumstances suggest coercion. Henry Bolingbroke then presented his claim to the throne. His lineage traced to Edward III through John of Gaunt, the king's third surviving son. However, the senior surviving line descended from Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's second son, through the Mortimer family. By strict hereditary primogeniture, the Mortimer claim was superior. Henry's accession as Henry IV therefore rested on a composite argument. Parliamentary endorsement, popular acclamation, and descent in the male line were combined to justify kingship. The official record declared that Henry claimed the crown by right of blood and through election. This dual basis marked a constitutional shift. Hereditary monarchy was no longer presented as automatic. It required political validation. The interpretive significance is substantial. Deposition established that kingship could be revoked for perceived failure, embedding conditionality into royal authority. Henry IV's early reign demonstrates the fragility of this settlement. The Epiphany Rising of January 1400, led by supporters of Richard II, sought to restore the deposed king. Although quickly suppressed, it revealed persistent loyalty divisions. Richard himself died in captivity in early 1400, likely at Pontefract Castle. While some chroniclers alleged starvation, modern historians emphasize the absence of definitive forensic evidence. His death eliminated an immediate rallying figure but did not erase doubts regarding legitimacy. More serious instability emerged in Wales. In September 1400, Owain Glyndwr declared himself Prince of Wales and initiated a sustained rebellion. Welsh administrative records and English campaign accounts indicate that the uprising combined national resistance with baronial dissatisfaction. Glyndwr secured French support after 1404, complicating English efforts at suppression. The conflict required repeated royal campaigns and imposed heavy financial strain on the crown. Archaeological surveys of Welsh fortifications confirm prolonged militarization in the region during this period. Simultaneously, Henry faced rebellion from former allies. Henry Percy, known as Hotspur, initially supported Bolingbroke's return. However, disputes over ransom payments from Scottish campaigns and dissatisfaction with royal patronage escalated tensions. The Percy revolt culminated in the Battle of Shrewsbury in July 1403. Contemporary accounts report fierce combat. Hotspur was killed, and the rebellion collapsed. A subsequent northern rising in 1405, involving Archbishop Scrope, further illustrated the volatility of aristocratic allegiance. These rebellions demonstrate a structural pattern. Because Henry IV's title rested partly on parliamentary sanction and magnate support, his authority depended on maintaining elite consensus. The crown's financial weakness limited patronage capacity, intensifying factional competition. Records of frequent parliamentary taxation grants between 1401 and 1410 indicate the regime's reliance on negotiated revenue rather than autonomous royal income. This dependency reinforced the precedent that monarchy required cooperation from the political nation. By 1413, when Henry IV died and was succeeded peacefully by his son Henry V, the Lancastrian dynasty had survived repeated challenges. Yet its security rested on political management rather than uncontested hereditary right. The stability of the new regime would soon depend on projecting authority beyond England's borders, particularly through renewed campaigns in France. If you value clear, research-driven historical documentaries grounded in evidence and careful chronology, consider subscribing. Click the notification bell to receive each new Nightfall release as it publishes. Military victory transformed a disputed dynasty into one that appeared invincible. When Henry V succeeded his father in March 1413, the Lancastrian monarchy had survived repeated rebellions but remained rooted in a contested act of deposition. The new king moved quickly to consolidate authority. Records from the first parliament of his reign indicate efforts to reconcile factions alienated under Henry IV. One symbolic gesture was the reburial of Richard II at Westminster Abbey in 1413, an act that publicly emphasized dynastic continuity rather than rupture. The gesture reduced the immediate political value of Ricardian loyalty as a source of opposition. Henry V soon redirected political energy outward. The long-running conflict with France, later known as the 100 Years' War, provided both opportunity and justification. English claims to the French crown derived from Edward III's assertion of rights through his mother, Isabella of France. Diplomatic exchanges recorded in the French royal archives show that negotiations in 1414 to 1415 failed to secure territorial concessions. In August 1415, Henry launched an invasion of Normandy, framing the campaign as enforcement of hereditary claims rather than aggression. The siege of Harfleur in September 1415 secured an initial foothold but weakened the English army through disease. As Henry marched toward Calais, French forces intercepted him near the village of Agincourt. Contemporary accounts, including those of Jean Froissart's continuators and the Gesta Henrici Quinti, describe the battle fought on October 25, 1415. English forces, heavily outnumbered, deployed longbowmen behind defensive stakes. Archaeological surveys of the battlefield terrain confirm constricted ground conditions caused by recent rain, which hindered French cavalry charges. The result was a decisive English victory, with significant losses among the French nobility. Agincourt carried strategic and political consequences. Militarily, it demonstrated the continued effectiveness of English longbow tactics against armored knights. Politically, it reinforced Henry's image as a divinely favored ruler. Royal proclamations and sermons framed the victory as evidence of providential support. The circulation of chronicles and poems celebrating the battle contributed to the consolidation of Lancastrian legitimacy at home. Parliament granted substantial subsidies in the aftermath, reflecting heightened confidence in royal leadership. Henry did not rely solely on a single victory. Between 1417 and 1419, he conducted a sustained campaign in Normandy. Records of the Norman exchequer indicate systematic occupation rather than raiding. Key cities, including Caen and Rouen, fell after prolonged sieges. By 1419, much of Normandy was under English administration. The campaign demonstrated logistical organization and fiscal planning, supported by parliamentary taxation and loans from merchants in London and Calais. The political culmination of these campaigns came with the Treaty of Troyes in May 1420. French royal records confirm that Charles VI of France recognized Henry as heir and regent, disinheriting his own son, the Dauphin Charles. The treaty also formalized Henry's marriage to Catherine of Valois, daughter of Charles VI. The agreement represented an unprecedented diplomatic achievement. An English king was acknowledged as future ruler of France. Ceremonial entries into Paris in 1420 further reinforced the impression of dual monarchy. The Treaty of Troyes altered the European balance of power. Burgundy, previously divided in allegiance, aligned with England after the assassination of Duke John the Fearless in 1419. This alliance isolated the Dauphin and limited French resistance in northern territories. Administrative records show that English officials began integrating Norman and French lands into a broader governance framework under Henry's regency. Despite these successes, structural challenges remained. The claim to France depended on continued military enforcement. The Dauphin retained support in southern France, and resistance persisted. Moreover, the English crown remained financially dependent on parliamentary taxation. The costs of occupation strained resources, as evidenced by repeated subsidy requests recorded in parliamentary rolls between 1417 and 1421. Military expansion strengthened royal prestige but did not resolve underlying fiscal dependency. Henry V's kingship relied heavily on personal authority. His leadership unified magnates who had previously competed for influence. By channeling aristocratic ambition into continental warfare, he reduced the likelihood of domestic factionalism. However, this cohesion was closely tied to his presence and military success. The institutional settlement of 1399, combining hereditary claim and parliamentary sanction, remained unchanged beneath the surface of triumph. In August 1422, Henry V died at Vincennes, likely from illness contracted during campaign. His only son, Henry of Windsor, was 9 months old. Within weeks, Charles VI of France also died, activating the provisions of the Treaty of Troyes. The English crown now rested on the head of an infant king ruling 2 realms in theory but facing organized resistance in practice. The premature death of Henry V in 1422 exposed the monarchy to renewed vulnerability. A brief skirmish in 1455 marked the beginning of open war between rival royal houses. By the early 1450s, the English crown faced cumulative strain from military defeat, fiscal weakness, and factional rivalry. The loss of Gascony in 1453, confirmed after the Battle of Castillon in July of that year, effectively ended English territorial ambitions in southwestern France. Government financial records and parliamentary petitions indicate rising dissatisfaction with the management of the war effort. Criticism increasingly focused on Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who had commanded in France during its final collapse. In August 1453, King Henry VI suffered a severe mental breakdown. Contemporary chronicles, including the Croyland Chronicle continuations, report that the king became unresponsive and incapable of recognizing even his newborn son, Edward of Westminster, born in October 1453. Modern medical historians have suggested possible hereditary mental illness, though definitive diagnosis remains speculative. What is certain from council records is that royal governance effectively ceased for more than a year. Without an active monarch, authority defaulted to competing noble factions. Richard, Duke of York, possessed a strong dynastic position. He descended from Edward III through both his father, Richard of Koningsbrugge, and his mother, Anne Mortimer, whose lineage traced to Lionel of Antwerp, second surviving son of Edward III. By strict primogeniture, this line had a superior hereditary claim to that of the Lancastrians, who descended from John of Gaunt, the third son. Although York had previously supported the crown, his rivalry with Somerset intensified during the French campaigns. The king's incapacity removed the central figure who had balanced these factions. In March 1454, Parliament appointed York as protector of the realm and chief counsellor. Official rolls confirmed that Somerset was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and York exercised authority over royal administration. This arrangement reflected a constitutional improvisation rather than formal deposition. The Protectorate acknowledged Henry VI as king but transferred executive power to York during incapacity. The settlement temporarily stabilized governance, yet it also elevated York's public standing. The political landscape shifted abruptly in late 1454, when Henry VI recovered sufficiently to resume nominal authority. Somerset was released and restored to influence. York's protectorate ended in February 1455. The reinstatement of Somerset signaled to York and his allies, particularly Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, that their position at court had weakened. Surviving correspondence from the Potton Letters, a collection of gentry family letters from Norfolk, reveals widespread uncertainty among landholders regarding shifts in royal favor and the enforcement of justice. These letters document concerns over patronage, protection, and legal outcomes, demonstrating how elite rivalry affected provincial society. By spring 1455, tensions escalated. York and Warwick assembled armed retainers, citing the need to remove evil counsellors from the king's presence. Royal writs indicate that Henry VI attempted to summon a great council at Leicester in May 1455. Yorkist forces intercepted the king's party at St. Albans on May 22, 1455. The confrontation, though brief, resulted in direct combat within the town streets. Contemporary accounts estimate relatively limited casualties compared to later battles, but the political impact was substantial. Among the dead were Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and Thomas, Lord Clifford. The deaths of these leading Lancastrian nobles eliminated key rivals and intensified blood feuds between aristocratic families. Archaeological surveys of St. Albans have identified structural damage consistent with urban combat, confirming that fighting occurred within the built environment rather than in open field formation. The engagement lasted only hours, yet it marked the first time armed confrontation between organized Yorkist and Lancastrian factions directly targeted the king's entourage. After the battle, Henry VI was taken into Yorkist custody, reportedly wounded by an arrow. Parliamentary records from November 1455 show York once again appointed protector. However, this restoration differed from 1454. The precedent of armed intervention against the king's advisors had now been established. The use of force to reshape royal council altered the political calculus. Authority no longer depended solely on negotiation within council chambers but could be influenced through military mobilization. The First Battle of St. Albans did not immediately produce full-scale civil war. For a time, reconciliation efforts continued. The Loveday Ceremony of March 1458 attempted symbolic unity between rival magnates. Yet the structural issues remained unresolved. Competing hereditary claims, mistrust between noble affinities, and the fragility of a monarchy vulnerable to incapacity. The deaths of Somerset and Northumberland deepened regional rivalries, particularly in northern England, where Percy and Neville retainers competed for influence. In institutional terms, St. Albans demonstrated that political grievances could escalate into targeted violence without dissolving the monarchy itself. Henry VI remained king, but his authority was increasingly contingent on which faction controlled access to him. Governance had shifted from centralized royal direction to negotiated dominance among magnates. Temporary reconciliation failed to address competing claims to authority. In 1460, Parliament altered the line of succession for the first time in generations. Following the uneasy reconciliation after the First Battle of St. Albans, factional distrust persisted beneath ceremonial gestures of unity. The Loveday procession of March 1458, staged in London, publicly displayed reconciliation between Lancastrian and Yorkist magnates. Yet administrative records and private correspondence indicate that neither side relinquished armed preparedness. Queen Margaret of Anjou increasingly assumed a central political role, particularly in safeguarding the interests of her son, Edward of Westminster. Her influence shifted the Lancastrian court toward firmer opposition to Richard, Duke of York. By 1459, both factions were actively mobilizing retainers. Royal commissions of array and Yorkist indentures demonstrate organized recruitment across the Midlands and Welsh marches. Armed confrontation resumed in September 1459 at the Battle of Blore Heath in Staffordshire. Yorkist forces under Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, encountered a larger Lancastrian army led by James Touchet, Lord Audley. Contemporary chronicles report that Salisbury's defensive positioning and use of terrain enabled a tactical victory despite numerical disadvantage. Audley was killed, and Lancastrian command temporarily disrupted. The engagement at Blore Heath did not secure Yorkist dominance. Later that month, the rival armies met near Ludlow at Ludford Bridge. Unlike earlier encounters, this confrontation ended without significant combat. Andrew Trollope, a Yorkist commander with experience in France, defected to the Lancastrian side during the night. His departure undermined Yorkist morale and exposed the vulnerability of affinity-based loyalties. York and his allies dispersed. York fled to Ireland, while Warwick and Edward, Earl of March, retreated to Calais. The Coventry Parliament of November 1459, sometimes termed the Parliament of Devils by Yorkist writers, passed sweeping acts of attainder against leading Yorkists, confiscating lands and formalizing their status as traitors. The use of parliamentary attainder in 1459 marked an escalation in legal warfare. Confiscation of estates not only punished rebellion but redistributed resources to Lancastrian supporters. Surviving parliamentary rolls document the scale of property transfers. Yet enforcement depended on military control, and Yorkist exile did not equate to political extinction. Calais, under Warwick's command, remained a strategic stronghold with access to continental trade and mercenary networks. Naval raids in early 1460, including the interception of a Lancastrian fleet near Sandwich, demonstrated that Yorkist forces retained operational capacity. In June 1460, Warwick and Edward landed in Kent with substantial support. Urban centers such as London admitted Yorkist forces with limited resistance, suggesting either popular sympathy or pragmatic calculation by civic authorities. The Royal Army confronted them at the Battle of Northampton on July 10, 1460. Contemporary accounts describe heavy rainfall and the defection of Lord Grey of Ruthin from the Lancastrian side, which opened defensive lines. The battle was brief. King Henry VI was captured, and several Lancastrian nobles were killed. With the king once more in Yorkist custody, the political situation shifted decisively. Richard, Duke of York, returned from Ireland in September 1460 and advanced a direct claim to the throne. According to the parliamentary record, York entered the chamber and placed his hand upon the royal throne, asserting hereditary right through the Mortimer line descending from Lionel of Antwerp. The claim exceeded his previous demand for reform and effectively challenged Lancastrian legitimacy at its foundation. Parliament debated the competing genealogies. Legal reasoning emphasized primogeniture and the seniority of Lionel's line over that of John of Gaunt. However, immediate displacement of Henry VI risked provoking instability. The compromise reached in October 1460 became known as the Act of Accord. The statute recognized Henry VI as king for life but declared Richard of York and his heirs as successors, thereby disinheriting Prince Edward of Westminster. Official copies of the Act preserved in parliamentary archives confirm the unprecedented alteration of hereditary succession. The Act of Accord represented a constitutional intervention of significant magnitude. Parliament not only validated York's hereditary superiority but formally redefined the line of succession. This action demonstrated the expanding role of representative institutions in adjudicating dynastic disputes. Yet the settlement did not bind those excluded from its provisions. Queen Margaret rejected the act, viewing it as unlawful dispossession of her son's birthright. Military mobilization resumed almost immediately in the north of England, where Lancastrian support remained strong. Noble affinities loyal to the Percy and Clifford families rallied against Yorkist authority. The Act of Accord, rather than resolving the crisis, intensified it by transforming a contest for influence into a struggle for the crown itself. The Act of Accord provoked a decisive Lancastrian counteroffensive. Victory at Towton secured a crown, but not yet a stable kingdom. The Battle of Towton, fought on March 29, 1461, eliminated the principal Lancastrian field army and allowed Edward, Earl of March, to assume the throne as Edward IV. Contemporary estimates, including figures preserved in the Croyland Chronicle, suggest exceptionally high casualties among the nobility and gentry. Yet the Yorkist triumph did not automatically secure national submission. Henry VI, Queen Margaret, and Prince Edward escaped northward into Scotland, where diplomatic records confirm that they received limited support from the Scottish crown in exchange for territorial concessions. Edward IV moved quickly to formalize his authority. Parliament convened in November 1461 and enacted sweeping measures against Lancastrian supporters. The parliamentary rolls list numerous acts of attainder targeting nobles who had fought at Towton or remained loyal to Henry VI. These legal instruments confiscated estates and transferred vast landholdings to Yorkist adherents. Redistribution of property strengthened the new regime but also created expectations of patronage among supporters. Land settlement became a central mechanism of political consolidation. The financial inheritance Edward received was constrained. Crown revenues had declined during the latter years of Henry VI's reign due to war losses in France and diminished royal estates. Exchequer records indicate arrears in customs duties and outstanding loans. Edward initially relied on traditional parliamentary taxation to finance administration and military defense. However, he also demonstrated greater attention to direct management of crown lands, appointing loyal officials to oversee revenue collection. Early signs of fiscal recovery appear in customs accounts from London and Calais by 1463. Despite formal coronation and parliamentary sanction, resistance persisted in the north. The Percy family, long dominant in Northumberland, had suffered heavy losses at Towton. Nevertheless, regional loyalties remained fluid. Lancastrian partisans regrouped around castles such as Bamborough and Dunstanburgh. Scottish involvement, confirmed in diplomatic correspondence from 1461 to 1462, provided material aid and safe haven to the displaced Lancastrian court. The northern border thus remained a zone of instability requiring sustained military attention. Edward delegated significant responsibility for northern operations to Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Warwick had played a decisive role in earlier Yorkist victories and commanded extensive affinity networks across the Midlands and North. Muster rolls and indentures reveal that Warwick could mobilize substantial retinues independent of direct royal funding. His position as Warden of the West March and his family's regional influence made him indispensable in suppressing rebellion. Military engagements continued intermittently between 1462 and 1464. The capture of Alnwick and Bamborough castles required coordinated siege operations. French assistance to the Lancastrian cause, arranged through Queen Margaret's diplomacy, briefly reinforced resistance. However, Yorkist naval strength and control of key ports limited sustained foreign intervention. By early 1464, the Lancastrian position had weakened significantly. The decisive confrontation occurred at the Battle of Hexham on May 15, 1464. Yorkist forces under John Neville, Warwick's brother, surprised a Lancastrian army led by Henry Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Contemporary accounts describe a rapid collapse of Lancastrian formations. Somerset and several leading supporters were executed shortly afterward. Hexham effectively destroyed organized Lancastrian military capacity within England. Henry VI remained at large for more than a year but lacked the resources to mount renewed resistance. With northern rebellion subdued, Edward pursued administrative stabilization. Judicial commissions were reactivated to restore local governance disrupted by conflict. Records from the Court of King's Bench indicate renewed enforcement of royal writs. The Crown's approach combined selective clemency with continued use of attainder against irreconcilable opponents. This calibrated policy reduced immediate insurgency while preserving Yorkist dominance. Edward's early governance also emphasized public order and mercantile stability. London's civic records show cooperation between the Crown and urban authorities to protect trade routes. Merchants benefited from reduced internal toll barriers and increased security along major roads. Although the broader economy had suffered from years of intermittent war, there was no systemic collapse of agricultural production. Tax assessments from 1463 suggest continuity in rural revenue streams. Three structural developments defined this phase of consolidation. First, legal mechanisms, particularly attainder and estate redistribution, functioned as instruments of regime change rather than mere punishment. Second, the reliance on magnate affinities, especially the nobiles, reinforced aristocratic influence within governance. Third, suppression of northern resistance demonstrated that military control remained essential to political legitimacy. By 1464, Edward IV had achieved what Henry VI could not: effective control over England's political center and its volatile northern frontier. Yet this stability was closely linked to aristocratic cooperation. The consolidation of power depended heavily on aristocratic alliances, particularly with the Earl of Warwick. A royal marriage reshaped the balance of power at court. In May 1464, Edward IV secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a Lancastrian widow whose first husband, Sir John Grey, had died fighting against the Yorkists. The marriage was conducted privately at Grafton and remained undisclosed for several months. When news reached the political nation, it generated surprise and unease. The Queen was not of foreign princely rank, nor did her family command vast territorial influence. The Woodvilles were respectable gentry elevated by service, but they lacked the entrenched magnate status of families such as the Nobiles or Percys. The political consequences were immediate. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, had been negotiating a potential French marriage alliance for Edward, one intended to strengthen diplomatic ties with Louis XI. Warwick's diplomacy aimed to position England within a continental framework that balanced Burgundian and French interests. The revelation that Edward had already married undermined these negotiations and diminished Warwick's influence in foreign policy. French envoys recorded confusion and frustration at the abrupt change in direction. The Woodville marriage also shifted the internal distribution of patronage. Within a short period, members of the Queen's family secured advantageous marriages and offices. Elizabeth's father, Richard Woodville, was created Earl Rivers. Her brothers and sisters were matched with heirs and heiresses of established noble houses. These alliances redistributed access to wealth and influence. The Neville affinity, long accustomed to prominence under Edward's early reign, perceived a contraction of its political centrality. The chronicler known as the author of the Croyland Chronicle observed the growing tension at court. Although the chronicle refrains from overt condemnation, it notes murmurs among nobles who resented what they perceived as disproportionate advancement of the Queen's kin. Patronage was a finite resource. Offices, wardships, and marriage arrangements constituted the currency of aristocratic politics. The Woodvilles' rapid ascent disrupted existing expectations. Foreign policy further complicated matters. Warwick favored closer alignment with France, consistent with his earlier diplomatic engagements. Edward gradually leaned toward Burgundy, influenced in part by commercial interests in the Low Countries and by the strategic value of Burgundian hostility to France. The Burgundian Duke, Charles the Bold, sought English partnership against French expansion. Customs records from London indicate the importance of cloth exports to Burgundian territories, underscoring the economic dimension of alliance choices. The divergence between Warwick's French orientation and Edward's Burgundian inclination reflected more than personal rivalry. It exposed competing visions of England's international posture. Parliament was not excluded from these deliberations, but the king's prerogative in diplomacy limited formal oversight. The absence of transparent consultation intensified suspicion among magnates who felt excluded from decision-making. At court, the Queen's influence became increasingly visible. She participated in patronage requests and interceded in disputes. Such intercession was not unprecedented for a medieval queen consort. However, the speed and scale of Woodville advancement distinguished this episode. Established magnates interpreted the pattern as encroachment upon traditional hierarchies. It is important to distinguish between systemic instability and elite competition. England in the mid-1460s did not experience widespread popular unrest attributable to the marriage. Taxation levels remained stable, and judicial administration continued without interruption. Revenue accounts suggest gradual fiscal improvement. The tension was concentrated within the upper aristocracy rather than diffused through the broader political community. Nevertheless, aristocratic politics were foundational to governance. Edward's authority relied on cooperation among leading families. The Nobiles, in particular, had provided military leadership and regional management during the fragile years following Toten. Warwick's affinity networks extended across the Midlands and North, linking gentry and tenants through bonds of service. Alienation at this level risked undermining the very structure that had secured Yorkist victory. By 1466 to 1467, Warwick's position had clearly weakened relative to the Woodvilles. His exclusion from key diplomatic initiatives and his perception of declining influence fostered resentment. Contemporary letters hint at factional alignments forming around competing centers of patronage. Although no open rebellion occurred during this period, the cohesion of the Yorkist coalition had fractured. The Woodville marriage thus marked a transition in Edward Ivy's reign. It signaled the king's assertion of personal autonomy in both domestic and foreign affairs. Yet that assertion came at the cost of aristocratic equilibrium. The consolidation achieved after Hexham depended upon magnate collaboration. The recalibration of patronage disturbed that balance. In 1470, the deposed king returned to the throne. The restoration of Henry VI in October 1470, an episode later known as the Readeption, was the product of calculated diplomacy rather than spontaneous uprising. The architect of this reversal was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, once the principal pillar of Yorkist rule. His estrangement from Edward IV, intensified by the Woodville ascendancy and foreign policy disagreements, had already led to rebellion in 1469. After the failure of renewed insurrection in early 1470, Warwick fled England, seeking support abroad. Warwick's exile led him to the court of Louis XI of France. Louis, a ruler adept at exploiting English instability, recognized an opportunity to weaken Burgundy, Edward Ivy's emerging continental ally. The French king facilitated negotiations between Warwick and his former adversary, Margaret of Anjou. The queen, long in exile and the most determined advocate of her husband Henry VI's claim, had previously regarded Warwick as a traitor responsible for Lancastrian defeats. Reconciliation required political necessity to override personal hostility. The agreement reached in Angers during the summer of 1470 formalized a remarkable reversal of loyalties. Warwick recognized Henry VI as rightful king and pledged to restore him. Margaret consented to a marriage alliance binding their factions together. Warwick's younger daughter, and Neville, would wed Prince Edward of Lancaster, the only son of Henry VI. The marriage, solemnized in France in December 1470 after the Restoration had occurred, symbolized the unification of Neville military capacity with Lancastrian dynastic legitimacy. This Franco-Lancastrian accord was underwritten by Louis XI's strategic calculations. France would provide ships and limited financial assistance to enable Warwick's return to England. In exchange, a restored Lancastrian regime would realign English diplomacy away from Burgundy. For Louis, the destabilization of Burgundian power justified the investment. English dynastic conflict thus intersected with broader continental rivalries. Warwick landed in England in September 1470. His arrival coincided with renewed unrest in the north and the defection of key Yorkist figures, including Edward Ivy's brother George, Duke of Clarence, who had earlier aligned himself with Warwick through marriage to Isabel Neville. The speed with which support coalesced around Warwick revealed the fragility of Edward's coalition once magnate backing fractured. Local gentry, bound by affinity ties, responded to Neville mobilization. Edward IV, confronted with rapid defections and lacking sufficient forces to contest Warwick immediately, fled to the Low Countries. He sought refuge with Charles, Duke of Burgundy, whose sister Margaret of York was Edward's sister. Burgundian court records confirm Edward's presence and the negotiations that followed. His flight removed the reigning monarch from English soil without decisive battle. With Edward in exile, Warwick moved to restore Henry VI. The former king, who had been held in the Tower of London since 1465, was released and ceremonially reinstated in October 1470. Parliamentary records from the Readeption session annulled Edward Ivy's kingship and reversed Yorkist acts of attainder. Official documents resumed dating by Henry's regnal years, as though the intervening decade had been an aberration. Yet the restored regime possessed inherent weaknesses. Henry VI's mental incapacity remained evident. Contemporary observers noted his passivity and detachment from governance. Effective authority rested not with the king but with Warwick and his associates. This reality raised constitutional ambiguity. Although Henry's legitimacy derived from hereditary right, executive power operated through magnate dominance. Margaret of Anjou herself did not immediately return to England. She remained in France with Prince Edward, partly to secure additional support and partly due to the hazards of travel during winter. The absence of the queen and heir during the initial months of restoration limited the regime's dynastic coherence. Symbolically, the Lancastrian line was not fully present within the kingdom it purported to govern. The political coalition underpinning the readaptation was also unstable. Clarence's loyalty was conditional and opportunistic. Other nobles who had reconciled with Warwick did so from calculation rather than conviction. The annulment of Yorkist land grants threatened renewed disputes over property and patronage. A decade of redistribution could not be undone without alienating those who had benefited from it. Internationally, the readaptation signaled a sharp diplomatic realignment. England's posture shifted toward France, alarming Burgundy. Charles the Bold now possessed both motive and justification to assist Edward IV's return. The English throne had become entangled in the strategic rivalry between Valois France and Burgundian ambition. By early 1471, the restored Lancastrian regime controlled the machinery of government but lacked consolidated military security. Its authority depended upon Warwick's capacity to deter Edward's return. No decisive campaign had yet been fought to eliminate the Yorkist claimant. Edward remained alive, politically connected, and increasingly supported by Burgundian resources. The deposed king had returned to the throne, but the conditions of his restoration ensured instability. The readaptation regime rested on magnate alliance, foreign backing, and a monarch unable to govern independently. It possessed legality but not permanence. Edward returned claiming only his duchy, and reclaimed his kingdom. In March 1471, Edward IV sailed from the Low Countries with a modest expeditionary force financed and facilitated by Charles, Duke of Burgundy. Burgundian assistance was not overwhelming in scale, but it was decisive in enabling Edward's departure. Approximately 1,000 to 2,000 troops accompanied him, including experienced mercenaries. On March 14, 1471, Edward landed at Ravensbourne on the Yorkshire coast, a site symbolically associated with Henry Bolingbroke's return in 1399. Initially, Edward adopted a cautious political posture. He publicly declared that he sought only the restoration of his rights as Duke of York, not the immediate recovery of the crown. This tactical claim reduced the likelihood of unified resistance among those uncertain about renewed conflict. It also mirrored Bolingbroke's earlier strategy of gradual escalation. Local support proved limited at first, but as Edward moved southward, additional adherents joined his force. The political landscape had shifted since 1470. Warwick's readaptation government controlled London and held Henry VI in its custody. Yet the regime's cohesion depended on rapid suppression of Edward's advance. Warwick attempted to coordinate forces with his brother John Neville, Marquis of Montague, who commanded substantial troops in the north. Miscommunication and the speed of Edward's movement undermined this coordination. A pivotal moment occurred when George, Duke of Clarence, defected once more, this time abandoning Warwick and rejoining his brother Edward. Clarence's decision deprived Warwick of a critical ally and restored dynastic unity within the House of York. The reasons for Clarence's reversal likely included distrust of Lancastrian restoration and calculation about long-term inheritance prospects. Whatever his motive, the defection significantly weakened the readaptation coalition. Edward entered London on April 11, 1471, without major resistance. The city's mercantile leadership, wary of prolonged instability, favored a decisive resolution. Henry VI was taken again into Yorkist custody. Edward's re-entry into the capital restored symbolic authority before a major battle had been fought. Yet Warwick remained in the field with a substantial army. The decisive engagement occurred at the Battle of Barnet on April 14, 1471, Easter Sunday. The battlefield lay north of London, enveloped in dense early morning fog. Contemporary accounts emphasize the confusion generated by limited visibility. Warwick's forces were numerically comparable to Edward's, though precise figures remain debated. Both armies deployed artillery and traditional retinue-based formations. Fog played a critical role in shaping the battle's outcome. A misalignment of lines led to friendly fire within the Lancastrian ranks when the Earl of Oxford's contingent, returning from a successful flank attack, was mistaken for Yorkist troops. Cries of treachery spread panic. Command cohesion deteriorated rapidly. Edward's army, benefiting from tighter discipline and centralized command, exploited the disorder. Warwick himself commanded on foot, a decision intended to signal resolve and prevent flight. When Lancastrian lines broke, he attempted to reach his horse but was overtaken and killed during the rout. His brother Montague also fell in the fighting. The deaths of both Neville leaders in a single engagement eliminated the dominant magnate house that had shaped English politics for over a decade. The Battle of Barnet represented more than a tactical victory. It marked the collapse of Neville dominance in national governance. Warwick had been central to both Yorkist triumph and Lancastrian restoration. His political flexibility, once an asset, had ultimately isolated him. With his death, the readaptation regime lost its principal military architect and organizer. Edward IV demonstrated strategic prudence throughout the campaign. His rapid march southward prevented consolidation of opposition. His temporary claim to the duchy avoided premature confrontation. His ability to secure London before battle enhanced legitimacy and morale. Barnet, though influenced by environmental contingencies, reflected effective operational planning. Yet the conflict was not concluded with Warwick's death. Margaret of Anjou and Prince Edward had finally landed in England on the very day Barnet was fought. Unaware of Warwick's defeat, they sought to rally remaining Lancastrian support in the west. The dynastic struggle therefore continued, now stripped of Neville mediation and centered directly upon the survival of the Lancastrian heir. Edward had reclaimed his capital and destroyed his most formidable rival. The political equilibrium of the 1460s, structured around Neville power, had ended decisively. What remained was a final confrontation between the restored Yorkist king and the remaining representatives of the Lancastrian line. After 1471, stability depended not on battlefields but on balance sheets. Edward IV's second reign, beginning after his victory in 1471, differed markedly from the turbulence of the preceding decade. With Lancastrian resistance extinguished and magnate opposition subdued, the king no longer faced immediate dynastic threats. The central challenge shifted from survival to sustainability. Political durability required reliable revenue, administrative efficiency, and independence from unpredictable parliamentary grants. Edward's response was a deliberate restructuring of royal finance and governance. The most significant institutional development was the expansion of the chamber system of finance. Traditionally, much royal revenue had been processed through the exchequer, a medieval institution characterized by formal procedures and delayed accounting cycles. The chamber, by contrast, operated as a more flexible and direct financial apparatus under the king's personal supervision. Revenue collected through chamber officials could be deployed rapidly without the bureaucratic lag associated with exchequer auditing. Edward's preference for chamber finance reflected lessons learned from earlier instability. During Henry VI's reign, chronic deficits and administrative fragmentation had weakened the crown's authority. By centralizing revenue management within the royal household structure, Edward enhanced both oversight and liquidity. Surviving account rolls indicate increased documentation of income streams flowing directly into the chamber after 1471. Customs revenues constituted the backbone of royal income. England's export economy was heavily dependent on wool and finished cloth, particularly through the port of London. The growth of the cloth trade during the later 15th century benefited the crown through tonnage and poundage duties. Customs accounts from the 1470s show a measurable rise in receipts compared to the depressed levels of the 1450s. Although fluctuations occurred, the overall trend supported greater fiscal predictability. Edward also revived and expanded the practice of benevolences, ostensibly voluntary contributions requested from wealthy subjects. Unlike parliamentary taxation, benevolences did not require formal parliamentary approval. Their use allowed the crown to raise funds quickly, though not without criticism. While contemporaries sometimes viewed these exactions as coercive, their selective application limited widespread resistance. The crown targeted affluent merchants and courtiers rather than imposing broad-based levies. Crown lands formed another critical revenue base. Through earlier attainders against Lancastrian nobles and through confiscations following the suppression of rebellion, Edward had acquired substantial estates. Rather than granting these lands permanently to magnates, a common practice under weaker monarchs, Edward increasingly retained them under direct royal management. This decision reduced dependence on aristocratic intermediaries and ensured a more consistent flow of income. Administrative reform accompanied fiscal restructuring. Edward appointed capable household officials and financial administrators, including men drawn from mercantile and legal backgrounds. Their expertise reflected the growing professionalization of governance. Rather than relying exclusively on hereditary magnate officeholders, the king employed trained administrators whose authority derived from royal service. Trade diplomacy reinforced financial strategy. The 1468 marriage alliance between Edward's sister Margaret of York and Charles, Duke of Burgundy, strengthened commercial ties with Burgundian territories. Burgundy was England's principal trading partner in cloth exports. Diplomatic correspondence and treaty provisions facilitated favorable customs arrangements and stabilized merchant activity across the Channel. The Treaty of London in 1474, negotiated with France, also had economic implications. Although primarily framed as a peace settlement, it reduced the likelihood of costly continental campaigns. The French pension promised to Edward under the treaty provided an additional source of income, albeit one contingent upon continued diplomatic compliance. By avoiding sustained military engagement in France, Edward conserved financial resources and avoided the fiscal strain that had burdened earlier reigns. Mercantile expansion during the 1470s reflected broader European economic recovery. London's merchant guilds benefited from improved security and royal support. The Crown enforced navigation regulations and encouraged English shipping interests. Although England did not yet possess a fully articulated mercantilist doctrine, policy favored domestic commercial growth. Increased port activity translated directly into customs revenue, reinforcing fiscal stability. The reduction of reliance on parliamentary taxation was a defining characteristic of Edward's mature regime. Parliament still met periodically, but its role in routine revenue generation diminished. This shift enhanced royal autonomy. Parliamentary sessions could focus on legislation rather than emergency grants. The political atmosphere thus became less adversarial than during earlier fiscal crises. However, financial independence required careful balance. Excessive demands through benevolences risked resentment among elites. Retention of lands limited opportunities for patronage distribution. Edward navigated these tensions by alternating firmness with selective generosity. Key nobles received rewards sufficient to secure loyalty, but systemic alienation was avoided. The cumulative effect of these reforms was a crown more solvent than at any point since the early 15th century. Contemporary observers noted the relative prosperity of the later 1470s. Court display, building projects, and diplomatic initiatives all reflected increased confidence in fiscal capacity. Stability was not absolute. No medieval regime could eliminate structural vulnerabilities, but the contrast with the financial disorder of Henry VI's rule was pronounced. After 1471, the York estate rested upon administrative discipline and commercial revenue rather than emergency mobilization. The battlefield had secured the throne. The ledger secured its endurance. Peace with France was purchased through negotiation, not conquest. By the mid-1470s, Edward IV had consolidated internal authority sufficiently to pursue an assertive continental policy, balancing the dual objectives of securing England's strategic interests and maintaining fiscal stability. Earlier Yorkist reigns had demonstrated the costs of prolonged campaigns in France, with Edward determined to avoid the fiscal strain and military attrition that had characterized Henry VI's French wars. Consequently, his approach combined limited military action with sustained diplomacy. In 1475, Edward launched a brief campaign in northern France, aimed primarily at asserting claims to the Duchy of Guyenne and projecting strength in support of Burgundian allies. Contemporary chronicles describe the mobilization of approximately 8,000 to 10,000 troops, a force considerably smaller than those assembled during the Hundred Years' War. The expedition involved both professional soldiers and retained noble contingents. The campaign advanced into Picardy but avoided major sieges or protracted combat, reflecting Edward's prioritization of political over territorial objectives. The campaign's central outcome was the Treaty of Picquigny, signed on August 29, 1475. Negotiations had been mediated by Louis XI, who sought to secure peace without war and to neutralize the threat of English support for Burgundian ambitions in Flanders. Under the treaty, Edward IV received a substantial pension from the French crown, paid in annual installments, alongside a one-time gratuity for himself and his leading magnates. Louis also agreed to pay for the withdrawal of English forces and pledged non-aggression, while Edward formally renounced further claims to French territories in exchange for recognition of his continental dignity. The treaty represented a pragmatic compromise, transforming a nominal military campaign into a fiscal and diplomatic advantage. The Treaty of Picquigny exemplified Edward's strategic priorities. Unlike predecessors who pursued conquest through extended warfare, Edward emphasized negotiation to achieve tangible benefits while conserving resources. The English crown secured direct financial gain, strengthened its position in continental trade networks, and avoided destabilizing military commitments. The pension payments provided a predictable income stream independent of parliamentary taxation, reinforcing the financial autonomy achieved through chamber reform. Anglo-Burgundian relations during this period were similarly shaped by pragmatic calculation. The 1468 marriage of Edward's sister Margaret to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, had established formal dynastic and diplomatic ties. Charles sought English support against French expansion in the Low Countries, while Edward leveraged Burgundian commercial and military networks to strengthen his domestic and foreign position. Trade treaties and preferential agreements with Burgundian ports enhanced the English cloth industry, which in turn increased customs revenue in London and Calais. Economic interdependence reinforced political alignment, providing Edward with a consistent framework for continental policy. Diplomatic correspondence demonstrates the careful balancing act Edward maintained between France and Burgundy. While the Treaty of Picquigny entailed financial subordination to Louis XI, Edward simultaneously cultivated Burgundian goodwill, emphasizing shared interests in Northern Europe and the Low Countries. Letters exchanged between Edward's chancellery and Charles the Bold reveal coordination on mercantile protection, maritime security, and the timing of military movements, illustrating the integration of economic and strategic considerations. The effectiveness of Edward's continental policy derived not solely from negotiation but also from his credible use of force. The mobilization to Picardy, though limited, signaled to France that England retained the capacity to project military power. This credibility ensured that the pension and other concessions were not perceived as coerced but rather as part of a mutually negotiated settlement between sovereign powers. Edward's approach demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of early modern statecraft, blending fiscal, military, and diplomatic levers. Furthermore, the Treaty of Picquigny helped stabilize domestic politics by reducing the necessity for expensive campaigns abroad. Edward could maintain troop levies at manageable levels and focus on governance and court administration. Revenue from French pension payments and continued customs income allowed the crown to reward loyal magnates without over-reliance on ad hoc taxation. Administrative continuity, financial security, and strategic diplomacy created a resilient framework for Yorkist rule. Despite these successes, the arrangement was inherently contingent. Pension payments relied on Louis XI's compliance, and the balance of European power remained volatile. Burgundy's strategic interests occasionally conflicted with those of France, while regional factions in the Low Countries retained the potential to disrupt trade or military coordination. Edward's policy, therefore, required ongoing engagement and careful attention to shifting alliances, a task complicated by the unpredictable dynamics of continental politics. Edward's continental strategy also had subtle implications for domestic perception of legitimacy. By securing peace through negotiation rather than conquest, He projected an image of measured kingship capable of achieving national objectives without exposing England to unnecessary risk. Mercantile and urban elites, whose wealth depended on secure trade, responded favorably, enhancing the crown's domestic stability. Meanwhile, aristocratic supporters benefited indirectly through pensions, offices, and influence in foreign affairs, sustaining loyalty within the Yorkist coalition. Yet even as Edward achieved diplomatic and financial stability, structural vulnerabilities remained within the domestic realm. Succession issues, magnate rivalries, and the lingering Lancastrian claim continued to pose latent threats. While the Treaty of Picquigny addressed foreign relations and fiscal security, it did not eliminate internal risks inherent in dynastic politics. The stability purchased abroad could be undermined by developments at home, particularly regarding inheritance and the integration of Yorkist and Woodville interests. Edward IV's continental policy between 1471 and 1475 thus represents a calculated balance of diplomacy, limited military action, and economic leverage. Peace with France was secured through negotiation rather than conquest, Burgundian alliances were maintained, and fiscal independence was reinforced. Yet domestic succession would soon undo this stability. Within weeks of a king's death, the line of succession was overturned. On April 9, 1483, Edward IV died unexpectedly, leaving his eldest son, Edward V, as heir. The new king, barely 13 years old, faced the immediate challenge of governance in a kingdom still reliant on aristocratic support. Royal records confirm that Edward IV's will designated his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector and Defender of the young king. The appointment was intended to secure the continuity of the Yorkist line, providing a stabilizing figure during the minority of Edward V. Initially, Richard presented himself as loyal to the deceased king's testament. Contemporary accounts, including entries in the Croyland Chronicle, note his public acceptance of the protectorate and engagement with the council. He took formal oaths to safeguard Edward V and maintain the kingdom's administration. Letters issued from the protector's household indicate immediate attention to ceremonial functions, revenue collection, and enforcement of royal justice, signaling continuity despite the sudden loss of Edward IV. Political tensions, however, emerged quickly. A faction loyal to the Woodville family, led by Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, and Richard Grey, Edward V's maternal uncle and half-brother, controlled key northern and southern strongholds. They had also secured custody of Edward V, which allowed them to exercise practical influence over royal policy. Gloucester supporters viewed this as a direct challenge to the authority of the protectorate. In response, Richard mobilized loyal retainers and leveraged long-standing naval networks to assert dominance in strategic regions, particularly along the Trent and in the Midlands. The critical constitutional question concerned the legitimacy of Edward V. Gloucester's political maneuvering culminated in the parliamentary session of June 1483. Acting through both council persuasion and political pressure, Gloucester presented claims that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid due to precontract with Lady Eleanor Butler. The legal argument, carefully recorded in parliamentary registers, declared Edward IV's offspring illegitimate, thereby disqualifying Edward V and his siblings from succession. The resulting parliamentary act, known as Titulus Regius, formally confirmed Richard of Gloucester as king. The statute specified that Edward IV's sons were illegitimate and incapable of inheriting the crown, thereby providing a legal foundation for Richard III's accession. Surviving copies of the act, preserved in the parliamentary rolls, illustrate the precision of its language. It targeted both Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, ensuring no immediate Yorkist rival could claim the throne. Richard's assumption of the crown was rapid. He was crowned on July 6, 1483 at Westminster Abbey, with ceremonial continuity emphasizing dynastic legitimacy. Chroniclers note that attendance included key northern and southern magnates, though the Woodville faction was largely excluded. The coronation reinforced Richard's claim, combining formal legality with public spectacle to project authority. The enforcement of Titulus Regius required both political and military measures. Key Woodville supporters were arrested or neutralized. Earl Rivers, Richard Grey, and Lord Vaughan were executed or imprisoned during the initial weeks of Richard's rule. The suppression of potential opposition relied on loyalty networks established during Richard's tenure as Duke of Gloucester in the north, reflecting the importance of regional affinity in stabilizing early governance. The act also reflected broader constitutional implications. It demonstrated that parliamentary authority could be used to redefine succession based on legal interpretation, setting a precedent for intervention in hereditary monarchy. While Edward Ivy's line was legally established as disqualified, the exercise of parliamentary endorsement highlighted the flexibility of English governance when faced with contested claims. Legal scholars of the later 16th century would refer back to Titulus Regius as an early example of parliamentary adjudication of dynastic legitimacy. Despite the legal and administrative consolidation, underlying instability remained. The young princes, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were lodged in the Tower of London under Richard's supervision. Their subsequent disappearance, likely in late summer 1483, intensified suspicion and eroded confidence in the regime, even among otherwise supportive magnates. Reports from contemporaneous chroniclers, including Dominic Mancini, underscore the climate of uncertainty and fear that followed. Richard III's protectorate and formal coronation achieved immediate dynastic control, but the foundation of his authority depended heavily on perception and enforcement. The legal redefinition of succession through Titulus Regius provided formal legitimacy, yet the elimination of rivals through imprisonment and possible murder revealed the persistent fragility of monarchical power. In the absence of Edward Ivy's military and political coalition, governance relied on centralized enforcement, regional loyalties, and control of narrative through parliamentary sanction. By the end of 1483, Richard III had secured the throne, reconfigured the line of succession, and neutralized immediate opposition. Yet the disappearance of the princes intensified suspicion. Two heirs vanished from public record in 1483. Following the coronation of Richard III in July 1483, Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, were confined to the Tower of London. Their presence, ostensibly for preparation toward the formal royal accession, soon became a focal point of political tension. Contemporary sources indicate that the princes were last publicly seen in late summer 1483, after which they disappeared from the historical record. The circumstances of their confinement and subsequent disappearance generated immediate speculation and chronicler attention, reflecting both the fragility of Yorkist legitimacy and the centrality of the royal line in English governance. Primary accounts of the period, though limited, provide conflicting perspectives. The Italian observer Dominic Mancini, present in England during the transition, reports that Richard III arranged the prince's confinement under safe custody, suggesting the appearance of protection rather than overt hostility. Mancini notes that public opinion in London was uneasy, fueled by rumors of foul play, yet no concrete evidence of murder is documented in contemporary administrative records. English chronicles, including the Croyland Chronicle continuations, similarly remark upon the prince's disappearance but refrain from ascribing direct responsibility. Political context illuminates the stakes. The prince's legitimacy represented a direct challenge to Richard III's claim. If either Edward V or Richard of York had survived, they could serve as figureheads for opposition, particularly among Yorkist loyalists and residual Lancastrian sympathizers. Their confinement in the Tower, the traditional royal stronghold and secure repository for high-profile prisoners, was consistent with established protocols for safeguarding vulnerable heirs. Yet the sudden cessation of their appearances created a vacuum that magnates and foreign observers interpreted as perilous. The historiographical debate over their fate has remained extensive. Early Tudor chroniclers, such as Polydore Virgil and Sir Thomas More, depict Richard III as culpable, framing the disappearance as a deliberate elimination of rival claimants. Later historians, including Charles Ross and Michael Hicks, approach the matter with caution, emphasizing the absence of definitive evidence while analyzing circumstantial factors. Richard's consolidation of power, the lack of secure oversight over the Tower, and the political incentives for removal. The debate is further complicated by reports of potential alternative claimants and the role of Elizabeth Woodville's faction, whose access to the princes was also constrained. The prince's disappearance also influenced parliamentary and legal developments. Richard III's Titulus Regius had legally nullified their claim, Yet the absence of the boys left unresolved issues of public perception and legitimacy. The English crown relied upon symbolic and procedural authority to compensate for the uncertainty surrounding the heir's status. Notices of Richard's coronation emphasized lawful succession and continuity, aiming to neutralize potential dissenters who might have rallied around Edward V or his brother. Archaeological evidence provides an additional layer of investigation. In 1674, during renovations of the Tower of London, workers discovered a box containing skeletal remains beneath a staircase within the White Tower. These bones were subsequently interred in Westminster Abbey with ceremonial recognition of their presumed royal identity. Although modern forensic analysis is limited by the condition of the remains, historical attribution has generally accepted them as those of the princes. The reburial reinforced the narrative of their disappearance but could not resolve the question of culpability. The political consequences were immediate. The disappearance galvanized opposition among magnates and foreign actors. Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant in exile, gained increased legitimacy as a distant but viable alternative. English nobles, particularly those alienated by Richard's centralization and the Woodville Purge of 1483, began considering alignment with Henry's claim. Contemporary correspondence from Brittany and France indicates that support for Henry's eventual invasion was framed in part by uncertainty regarding the fate of the Yorkist heirs. Additionally, the psychological impact on the nobility was significant. While Richard III maintained control over the machinery of government, his apparent role in the prince's disappearance engendered mistrust. Magnates relied upon visible enforcement of loyalty and the demonstration of predictable succession. The unaccounted absence of Edward V and Richard of York undermined confidence in the continuity of authority and the reliability of central governance. Economic and administrative functions remained operational, yet the political environment grew increasingly polarized. The absence of the princes highlighted structural weaknesses in Yorkist rule. Legitimacy could be contested not only through military means but also through perception, rumor, and dynastic uncertainty. This fragility became a central feature of opposition strategy, as distant claimants could now position themselves as protectors of the rightful heirs. By the end of 1483, the disappearance of Edward V and Richard of York had established a pivotal turning point. While Richard III retained the crown, the unresolved fate of the princes undermined the perception of secure succession, weakened aristocratic confidence, and encouraged foreign and domestic actors to coalesce around an alternative claimant. Opposition coalesced around a distant claimant. In 1485, a claimant with a tenuous hereditary right secured the crown through conquest. On August 22, 1485, Henry Tudor decisively defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, ending decades of dynastic conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. Henry's claim to the English throne was tenuous. He was a distant Lancastrian descendant through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, of John of Gaunt's legitimized line. Despite the weakness of his hereditary right, Henry immediately framed his victory as both lawful and politically authoritative. His reign was officially backdated to August 21, 1485, one day before the battle, thereby enabling attainders against supporters of Richard III and consolidating the perception of legitimacy derived from conquest. The legal foundation of Henry's kingship was reinforced through formal coronation and parliamentary recognition. On October 30, 1485, Henry was crowned at Westminster Abbey, with ceremonial emphasis on continuity of royal authority. The selection of officiating clergy and heraldic display underscored his succession as sanctioned by both God and law. Parliamentary sessions convened shortly afterward ratified the annulment of Richard III's acts, including the controversial Titulus Regius, which had declared Edward IV's children illegitimate. Repealing this act formally restored Yorkist legitimacy to the succession line, creating the legal framework for dynastic reconciliation. Central to this reconciliation was the strategic marriage of Henry VII to Elizabeth of York in January 1486. Elizabeth, eldest daughter of Edward IV, represented the surviving Yorkist claim to the throne. The union served a dual purpose. It linked the rival houses of Lancaster and York, symbolically ending decades of conflict, and it reinforced Henry's position as king by integrating Yorkist legitimacy into his reign. Contemporary records, including accounts from the royal household, described the ceremony as a careful display of dynastic unity, incorporating heraldic motifs and courtly ritual designed to convey both authority and reconciliation. The marriage also had practical implications for patronage and magnate relations. Henry immediately balanced rewards between former Yorkist supporters and his Lancastrian adherents, consolidating loyalty across political factions. For example, previously attainted Yorkist nobles who accepted the Tudor settlement were restored to estates and offices, while the Beaufort network was maintained with strategic appointments. This careful management of elite interest helped prevent the outbreak of localized rebellions and secured the crown's influence over regional strongholds. Symbolism reinforced the political strategy. The creation of the Tudor Rose, combining the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, provided a visible emblem of dynastic unity. Coinage, banners, and court seals prominently displayed the rose, ensuring that visual representation of reconciliation permeated both civic and military arenas. The emblem functioned not merely as propaganda but as a structural signal that legitimacy could be derived from both conquest and familial integration. Henry also leveraged legislative and financial instruments to solidify authority. The backdating of his reign enabled legal justification for the confiscation of estates held by Richard III's supporters, enhancing the crown's fiscal base. Revenues from confiscated lands, alongside routine taxation and feudal dues, funded administration, royal ceremony, and military preparedness. Financial independence supported political legitimacy, reinforcing Henry's autonomy from both domestic magnates and foreign powers. The union of Henry and Elizabeth symbolically united competing lines, but it did not fully eliminate residual Yorkist opposition. Localized pockets of dissent, particularly in the north and west, continued to recognize the pre-Tudor claims or maintained loyalty to Yorkist-affiliated magnates. The most prominent of these challenges emerged during 1486 to 1487, including early conspiracies and rebellions such as the Lovell-Stafford Rising. These incidents demonstrated that while legal sanction, dynastic marriage, and symbolic reconciliation strengthened Henry's position, legitimacy in late medieval England also depended upon the continued suppression of residual claimants and active cultivation of noble loyalty. Henry VII's early reign exemplified the dual strategies required to consolidate authority: legal and symbolic legitimacy combined with careful patronage management. By marrying Elizabeth of York, repealing titulus regius, and integrating former Yorkist elements into governance, Henry established both a dynastic and institutional foundation for Tudor rule. Yet the presence of remaining Yorkist loyalists meant that consolidation was an ongoing process rather than a singular achievement. Within 2 years of Bosworth, a new Yorkist king was proclaimed in Ireland. The early years of Henry VII's reign were marked by political fragility, as Yorkist loyalists sought to challenge the newly established Tudor dynasty. In 1486, Lambert Simnel emerged as the figurehead of a renewed Yorkist claim. A boy of obscure origin, Simnel was coached by Richard Simons, a former cleric, to impersonate Edward, Earl of Warwick, the legitimate Yorkist heir then imprisoned in the Tower of London. Simons leveraged Simnel's resemblance and youth to craft a compelling, if entirely fabricated, dynastic narrative. Support for the rebellion coalesced among disaffected Yorkist nobles. John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, nephew of Richard III and former Yorkist claimant, assumed leadership of the movement, lending credibility and strategic direction. Lincoln sought continental assistance, appealing to Margaret of Burgundy, sister of Edward IV, who had vested interest in restoring Yorkist power. Financial backing from Burgundy enabled recruitment of mercenary troops, particularly German pikemen, and facilitated transport to Ireland, where Yorkist support was strongest. Ireland played a pivotal role in legitimizing the rebellion. The Anglo-Irish nobility, still loyal to the Yorkist line, formally crowned Simnel as King Edward VI in Dublin in 1487. Chroniclers emphasized that this ceremony, conducted with full heraldic display and ceremonial ritual, provided symbolic authority to the pretender and rallied Irish military support. The Irish contingent represented both a loyalist base and a staging ground for the subsequent invasion of England. In the spring of 1487, the rebel army crossed the Irish Sea, landing in northwest England. Henry VII responded with rapid mobilization, leveraging both regional militias and retained troops loyal to the crown. Contemporary financial records indicate expenditure on troop levies, supply transport, and logistical support, highlighting the crown's capacity to project authority swiftly across multiple regions. Henry's administration also worked to secure loyalty from key magnates in the north, whose local influence was essential to contain the uprising. The rebellion culminated at the Battle of Stoke Field on June 16, 1487. The engagement involved approximately 8,000 to 9,000 combatants on both sides, including Irish levies, German mercenaries, and English noble retainers. Henry's forces utilized disciplined formations and coordinated archery and infantry tactics to counter the mixed composition of rebel troops. The battle, often considered the final engagement of the Wars of the Roses, was decisive. Yorkist forces were defeated, Lincoln was killed, and the rebel army was effectively annihilated. The defeat at Stoke had immediate and long-term consequences. Leading conspirators, including prominent Irish supporters and Burgundian mercenaries, were executed or imprisoned. Lambert Simnel, remarkably, was spared due to his youth and employed in the royal kitchens, reflecting Henry's pragmatic approach to neutralizing symbolic threats while avoiding unnecessary martyrdom that could inspire future claims. Other participants faced attainder, confiscation of lands, and fines, reinforcing the crown's authority and deterring subsequent rebellions. Stoke Field demonstrated both the persistence of Yorkist factionalism and the vulnerabilities of early Tudor rule. Despite Henry's legal and symbolic consolidation through marriage to Elizabeth of York, residual loyalty to the pre-Tudor line persisted among regional magnates, foreign backers, and Irish allies. The rebellion underscored the need for continuous vigilance, rapid military response, and strategic management of noble loyalty to maintain the crown's authority. The suppression of Simnel's revolt marked a critical turning point. It eliminated organized Yorkist military resistance, secured the legitimacy of Henry VII's reign, and reinforced the effectiveness of Tudor administrative and fiscal measures. The crown's ability to finance, coordinate, and execute a rapid response highlighted the maturation of centralized authority, contrasting sharply with the fractured governance that had characterized the Wars of the Roses. With the defeat at Stoke, organized Yorkist military resistance effectively ended. The Wars of the Roses were fought less by national armies than by networks of allegiance. The military landscape of late 15th-century England was defined by a system commonly termed bastard feudalism, wherein nobles maintained retinues of men loyal to them through direct bonds of service rather than purely through land tenure. This model differed fundamentally from earlier feudal obligations tied to landholding, reflecting both the professionalization of armed followings and the increasing importance of personal loyalty. Affinity networks, the extended households and retainers of magnates, became the principal instrument through which military campaigns were organized, financed, and executed. Historian K.B. McFarlane characterized bastard feudalism as a functional adaptation to the political and economic realities of the period, enabling magnates to mobilize forces quickly without reliance on formal levies. Retainers were bound by indentures, formal contracts stipulating service obligations, remuneration, and conditions of engagement. Payments often included wages, provisions, and grants of office or minor estates, ensuring both loyalty and flexibility. These arrangements allowed magnates to maintain standing forces independent of royal summons, creating a dual system of national and private military capability. Christine Carpenter and other scholars have highlighted the duality of the system. While some critics interpreted it as evidence of aristocratic overreach and systemic decay, evidence suggests it was a coherent method of sustaining military readiness in a kingdom with limited central authority. Indentures preserved hierarchical command structures while accommodating local variations, particularly in regions where royal administration was weaker. They also reinforced social hierarchies, embedding loyalty within reciprocal networks of obligation and patronage. Livery badges were a key instrument of affiliation. These badges, worn on clothing or displayed on property, identified retainers and symbolized allegiance to a particular lord. Contemporaneous records, including city ordinances and parliamentary statutes, frequently addressed the display of livery, demonstrating concern over the visibility of private armed networks in urban and rural contexts. The use of livery both facilitated organization and transmitted political signals. signaling magnate influence and shaping local perceptions of power. Northern England provides illustrative examples. The Neville affinity, centered in Yorkshire and Durham, commanded both economic resources and manpower sufficient to challenge rival magnates or royal forces. Through a combination of retainers, livery, and local networks, the Nevilles were capable of rapid mobilization for campaigns such as the early Yorkist invasions in the 1450s and 1460s. Similarly, the Percy affinity, based in Northumberland, operated with comparable autonomy, coordinating military responses against Scottish incursions while also engaging in domestic factionalism. The interplay of these affinities demonstrates how private networks both supported and destabilized royal authority. The financial underpinning of bastard feudalism was complex. Magnates funded retinues through estate income, grants from the crown, and marriage alliances that provided access to additional resources. Indentured retainers received wages proportional to rank and the expected duration of service, allowing lords to adjust force size according to campaign needs. This flexibility contrasted with rigid feudal levies, which were tied to land and subject to seasonal constraints, and contributed to the speed and scale of mobilization during the Wars of the Roses. Recruitment was also influenced by social expectation and personal ties. Retainers often served multiple generations of a noble household, creating continuity of experience and local knowledge. The retention system encouraged loyalty through shared economic and social incentives, including access to patronage, legal protection, and career advancement. These networks extended beyond military function, shaping local governance, judicial enforcement, and economic interaction, thereby reinforcing magnate power in both wartime and peacetime. The organization of retinues affected battlefield tactics. Magnate networks operated as cohesive units with defined command hierarchies, facilitating coordinated maneuvers. Experienced retainers could be deployed in flanking operations, defensive positions, or shock attacks, as observed at Towton, 1461, and Barnet, 1471. The flexible, contract-based nature of these forces allowed lords to adapt their strategy to terrain, enemy composition, and seasonal conditions, providing a significant advantage over rigidly levied contingents. The Wars of the Roses thus exemplify the interaction between social structure and military capacity. Bastard feudalism provided both the foundation for rapid troop mobilization and a persistent source of instability, as competing networks often challenged royal authority. While the system enabled effective engagement in multiple theaters, it also generated recurring rebellions and factional conflict, revealing the limits of centralized control in late medieval England. Archaeology has revealed the physical cost of dynastic conflict. The battles of the Wars of the Roses were fought with a combination of traditional medieval methods and innovations adapted to the unique political and social landscape of 15th-century England. Commanders relied on integrated formations combining longbowmen, billmen, and dismounted men-at-arms, supported in limited instances by early artillery. While chroniclers emphasized heroic charges and noble leadership, archaeological evidence, particularly from the Towton battlefield, provides a granular view of the intensity and lethality of combat. Towton, fought on March 29, 1461, remains the largest engagement of the period. Excavations beginning in 1996 uncovered over 3,000 skeletal remains, many exhibiting sharp force trauma consistent with sword and polearm wounds, as well as blunt force injuries from poleaxes and flails. Skeletal analysis revealed a preponderance of head and upper torso injuries, indicative of close-quarters combat and the prominence of men-at-arms in frontal engagements. The distribution of arrowheads corroborates historical accounts that longbowmen played a decisive role, softening opposing lines and disrupting formations before the melee. Tactical organization relied heavily on combined arms. Longbowmen, deployed in front or along flanks, inflicted casualties from a distance, particularly effective against tightly packed infantry. Billmen, wielding long pole weapons, filled gaps in the line and countered cavalry charges. Dismounted men-at-arms, often knights or elite infantry, served as both shock troops and stabilizing elements, providing resilience under sustained attack. Coordination between these units was critical. Commanders like Edward IV and Richard III emphasized positioning, terrain exploitation, and contingency deployment in contemporary chronicles and muster rolls. The Battle of Barnet, April 14, 1471, illustrates tactical adaptation to environmental conditions. Fog and early morning mist created disorientation, which contributed to friendly fire incidents and misidentification of banners. Archaeological and textual sources suggest that dense formations of dismounted men-at-arms were supplemented by longbowmen positioned to support flanking maneuvers, with livery badges serving as visual guides for unit cohesion. Rapid communication via mounted messengers and trumpeters was essential to maintaining alignment under chaotic conditions. Bosworth Field, August 22, 1485, demonstrates the integration of infantry, cavalry, and emerging artillery. While artillery remained limited and primarily used for defensive disruption, its presence reflects gradual technological incorporation. Cavalry units, though not numerically dominant, were decisive in exploiting gaps in infantry lines or in pursuing retreating forces. Commanders employed concentrated attacks on exposed flanks, and the collapse of one side often precipitated a rout, illustrating the criticality of morale and formation integrity alongside physical weaponry. Material evidence reinforces the lethal environment of these engagements. Totten mass graves reveal a high incidence of lethal wounds consistent with repeated, concentrated strikes rather than sporadic duels. Trauma analysis suggests sustained, close-range violence over extended periods, contradicting earlier historiography that emphasized brief, decisive clashes. The physical evidence aligns with documented casualty figures and accounts of battlefield chaos, providing a concrete understanding of the human cost and operational scale of late medieval English warfare. Weaponry itself reflected social and economic factors. Longbows required sustained training, giving a structural advantage to communities with established archer traditions, such as Yorkshire and Kent. Billmen often came from urban or rural militias, with recruitment influenced by local patronage and lordly networks. Men-at-arms were typically wealthier retainers, capable of maintaining armor and mounts, illustrating how military capacity was directly linked to social status and economic resources. Artillery, although minimal, indicates the early stages of technological integration, often controlled by specialized crews under noble supervision. The combination of archival records and archaeological analysis underscores the interaction between tactics, social organization, and regional capacity. Nobles relied upon affinity networks to muster cohesive units, and effective deployment demanded discipline, experience, and communication. Conversely, battlefield outcomes reinforced the social hierarchy, as combat exposure determined prestige, reward, and the distribution of offices. Chroniclers' emphasis on heroic deeds complements the physical evidence, providing a holistic picture of the interdependence between strategic planning, material conditions, and human endurance. In the 15th century, Parliament became an instrument of dynastic warfare. Parliament during the Wars of the Roses functioned as both a legislative body and a tool of political consolidation, particularly in the hands of ruling factions seeking to secure dynastic legitimacy. One of the most significant instruments of parliamentary power was the Act of Attainder, which allowed the Crown to legally declare individuals guilty of treason without trial, confiscate their lands, and strip them of civil rights. This mechanism was employed extensively by both Lancastrian and Yorkist regimes to eliminate opposition, reward loyalty, and reinforce control over regional magnates. Edward IV's early parliaments provide illustrative examples. Following his victory at Totten in 1461, the king summoned Parliament to confirm the legal and financial consequences of his military success. Acts of Attainder targeted prominent Lancastrians, including the Duke of Somerset and other supporters of Henry VI, transferring estates to loyal Yorkist retainers and reinforcing Edward's fiscal and political base. Parliamentary rolls record detailed inventories of confiscated lands, demonstrating both the precision and reach of this legal instrument. The constitutional implications of Attainder extended beyond property confiscation. By formalizing the removal of political opponents, Parliament provided a veneer of legality to actions that might otherwise be considered arbitrary. Legal scholars of the period noted that reversing attainders after regime changes, such as the repeal of Edward IV's attainders under Henry VI during the readoption of 1470 to 1471, required careful legislative procedure. These reversals underscored the extent to which Parliament had become central to adjudicating claims of loyalty, legitimacy, and succession, effectively codifying what had once been resolved through force alone. Parliament also legitimized shifts in succession. The Act of Accord in 1460, which designated Richard, Duke of York, as heir over the infant Prince Edward, required formal parliamentary sanction. Similarly, Titulus Regius in 1483 legally declared Edward IV's children illegitimate, authorizing Richard III's accession. In both cases, parliamentary authority was crucial. It transformed dynastic conflict into a series of legally recognized acts, providing a mechanism to resolve disputes over succession while simultaneously signaling the crown's power to enforce compliance. The process of enacting attainders and succession legislation was itself highly structured. Parliamentary sessions involved formal readings, committee review, and the issuance of writs to ensure regional magnates were informed. Chroniclers such as the Croyland Continuations described the ceremonial aspects of the proceedings, emphasizing the visibility and legitimacy conferred by parliamentary endorsement. The inclusion of witnesses, oaths, and heraldic display reinforced the performative dimension of governance, creating a link between legal sanction and public perception. The strategic use of attainder also had broader implications for political culture. By codifying treason and disloyalty, Parliament shifted the locus of authority from purely martial or personal enforcement to institutional oversight. Magnates could no longer rely solely on private force or affinity networks to secure position. Their status was increasingly dependent upon formal recognition by legislative authority. Conversely, loyal service to the crown was incentivized through the redistribution of confiscated estates and titles, creating a feedback loop in which legal sanction, economic reward, and political allegiance were intertwined. Even as Parliament strengthened the crown's authority, it remained a contested space. Attendance and participation were limited to a select group of peers and representatives of boroughs, leaving broader society largely excluded. Nevertheless, the acts passed in these sessions had lasting consequences for land tenure, inheritance, and regional governance. Attainders were sometimes reaffirmed across successive reigns, demonstrating continuity and reinforcing the perception of legal permanence, even amidst the volatility of dynastic change. The 15th century thus witnessed the transformation of Parliament into a central instrument of governance during periods of dynastic conflict. Legal mechanisms like attainder formalized the removal of rivals, validated succession claims, and structured relations between crown and magnates. In doing so, Parliament mediated the balance between force and law, embedding political authority within codified, enforceable statutes. History of the Wars of the Roses was first written by the victors. The conclusion of dynastic conflict under Henry VII did not merely establish the Tudor monarchy. It also shaped the historical record of the Wars of the Roses. Early Tudor chroniclers, including Polydore Vergil and Edward Hall, provided foundational narratives that framed the conflict as a period of moral disorder resolved by the rightful authority of the Tudors. Polydore Vergil, writing in the early 16th century, emphasized the illegitimacy and cruelty of Richard III, portraying the Yorkist reign as inherently unstable and morally compromised. Vergil's accounts, though often drawing upon official records and oral testimony, were influenced by Tudor political priorities and access to royal archives. Edward Hall, in his union of the two noble and illustre families of Lancaster and York, similarly presented the wars as a dynastic struggle culminating in the lawful and stabilizing authority of Henry VII. Hall focused on the legal and ceremonial elements of succession, including the repeal of Titulus Regius and the marriage of Henry VII to Elizabeth of York, interpreting these events as acts that reconciled former rival factions. His narrative consistently framed the Tudors as restorers of order, a perspective reinforced by the commissioning of official records and propagandistic imagery within the royal court. Both Vergil and Hall contributed to a historiographical framework that linked political legitimacy with moral and civic order. They emphasized the dangers of disputed succession, factional violence, and the manipulation of noble affinities, often attributing instability to the personal failings of Yorkist leaders. This framing created a precedent in English historical writing in which the assessment of political actors was closely tied to their relationship with the ruling regime. The emphasis on narrative coherence and moral causality reflected both scholarly intent and courtly patronage, highlighting the intersection of documentation, interpretation, and ideology. The Tudor historiography also employed selective evidence to support political claims. Key documents, including parliamentary rolls, attainder records, and letters patent, were cited to demonstrate the legal invalidity of rival claims and to underscore the righteousness of the Tudor line. Chronicles highlighted the perceived chaos of previous reigns, presenting events such as the disappearance of the princes in the Tower, the Simnel and Warbeck rebellions, and the repeated shifts in succession as cautionary exemplars of disorder resolved through Tudor authority. In this way, historiography functioned not only as record but also as legitimizing instrument. Before we move forward, make sure to hit the subscribe button, click the bell icon to receive daily Nightfall history videos, and comment below with your favorite part of this deep dive into the Wars of the Roses.